Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished panelists and delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by congratulating the President of the Human Rights Council on his election. It is an honor to participate and address you at this high-level panel discussion on the judiciary's contribution to advancing human rights and the question of the death penalty. Mr. President, Zimbabwe passed a law to abolish the death penalty on the 31st of December 2024. Now here's our story. Mr. President, Zimbabwe's story on the abolition of the death penalty is woven in three distinct yet interconnected phases. The first phase is the pre-colonial era, and this is shaped by traditional values and restorative justice. The second phase being the colonial period, marked by the imposition of retributive justice and the death penalty, and lastly, the post-colonial era, characterized by our ongoing quest for justice, reconciliation, and human rights. It is within this context, Mr. President, that I wish to explore the critical role of the judiciary in enhancing human rights and abolishing the death penalty. Mr. President, traditional practice was that offenders were required to compensate the victim's family or face avenging spirit of the deceased. And as part of our culture, Mr. President, death was not just physical, but it also involved spiritual termination. So this approach, Mr. President, may I share, is deeply rooted in Ubuntu concept, which emphasizes community, interconnectedness, and mutual support. The death penalty was introduced by colonial powers in my country in the 18th century and remained in place even beyond the attainment of Zimbabwe's independence. At independence, Zimbabwe inherited a wide array of offenses that called for the death penalty. Since then, various legislative and policy interventions have been implemented to gradually reduce the number of crimes attracting the death penalty. In 2013, the number of offenses attracting the death penalty were reduced from 9, and we remained with only one offense, namely murder committed in aggravating circumstances. Mr. President, Zimbabwe's journey towards abolition of the death penalty has been long and progressive, mostly characterized by consultations, surveys, outreach programs, judicial reviews, and policy interventions, eventually culminating into legislative intervention. In 1999, the Constitutional Commission in Zimbabwe conducted a survey, and it came up with a result that showed that a greater proportion of our population still preferred the death penalty. Sadly, between 1980 and 2005, 105 convicted offenders were executed. Since then, no other executions have been carried out in Zimbabwe, and this can be attributed to policy coupled with judicial discretion against capital punishment. The courts have consistently identified extenuating circumstances to mitigate sentences, thereby avoiding the imposition of the death penalty. In 2013, we adopted a homegrown constitution, and this constitution came with an expansive Bill of Rights, and the expansive Bill of Rights took into consideration social, political, economic, and other rights to protect human rights. So these reforms, coupled with strong political will from our leadership, I would like to mention particularly our current president, Dr. Mnangagwa, who paved the way for eventual abolition of the death penalty because of his progressive policies. May I also share that our president was at one stage on the death row, him having committed a political crime, and was only to be saved by his tender age at that time. So clearly you can see how we view the death penalty. The government of Zimbabwe actively engaged with human rights organizations, international bodies to ensure that the abolition process was grounded in best practices. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights has also played a very instrumental role in advocating for the abolition of the death penalty across the continent and in Zimbabwe in particular. Zimbabwe's recent constitutional and legislative reforms resonate with these commitments, reflecting our dedication to upholding regional and international rights principles. May I at this stage also mention the Embassy of Switzerland in Zimbabwe They have worked so tirelessly to support our outreach programs, our consultations, and many other humanitarian activities geared towards the abolition of the death penalty, and we're very grateful. Mr. President, let me also touch briefly on our constitutional provisions, which also aided the abolition of the death penalty. Mr. President, I can say the pride and prime of Zimbabwe's constitution lies in our Section 48. And this Section 48 firmly entrenches the right to life. So because of this provision, we have shaped legal interpretations of capital punishment and played a crucial role in defining the nation's legal framework. The abolition of the death penalty in 2024 is a significant milestone for Zimbabwe. It further places a positive legal obligation on the minister responsible. I'm talking of the Act. It places a legal obligation on the minister responsible for justice, the Prosecutor General, and the Commissioner General of Prisons to do everything within their respective competencies to ensure every prisoner under sentence of death is now going to be brought before the High Court for resentencing. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is hoped that Zimbabwe's journey serves as a model for other nations who are yet to abolish the death penalty. Ongoing legislative reforms will further cement the absolute abolition of the death penalty in Zimbabwe. May I lastly mention that we still have a constitutional provision which may give leeway for those that may have the mind of resuscitating the death penalty. So we continue to work hard to make sure that we also effect a constitutional amendment in order to attain absolute abolition. I thank you, Mr. President.